Good morning. Actually, I'm recording this in the evening, but you will be listening to this in the morning. We're moving to our next chapter. Our next chapter are going to be next two chapters, chapters 10 and 11, which is basically going to be the PowerPoint that follows it is called "Rise and the Fall of the Middle Ages." Um, Both of these chapters are actually fairly similar. They deal with the same sort of issues, the same countries, the same events, except they kind of catch them in two different phases. Um, the first part is the rise of medieval monarchies in Western Europe. In particular, they're talking about several. That is England, France, German, something like it, Spain. Those are the four great monarchies. Um, and one of the consequences was that in Germany, actually, and in Italy, a centralized monarchy of a feudal type failed to appear. So the countries were fragmented into some very, very small pieces. And we'll talk about it later on when the time comes to talk about the Renaissance. So that's what this chapter is about. It talks about European kingdoms, their rise, the relationship with the papacy, with the church, and the crisis that they encountered during the event that we call the Great Plague. So, two of these are connected here. The Great Plague started roughly in 1346-47. It took about 1 or 2 years to catch up. And it spread all over Europe very, very quickly, killing about roughly 1/3 of the population. Your slide number 5 in chapter 11, Spielvogel says high mortality rate with losses between 25 and 50% of the population, and the pattern was similar that we see today. Is the big cities that suffered the most because of the highest concentration of people and the easy way that the plague is transmitted. Anyways, so we have then we're talking about the period from looking at Spielvogel, slide number 2 in chapter 10, and which gives you the basic outline of this chapter. The emergence and growth of European kingdom from 1000 to 300, the recovery and reform of the Catholic Church, the Christianity and medieval civilization, and the Crusades. So, several very interesting topics. Let's start with emergence and the growth of European kingdoms. Slide number 3 says, focus question. What steps did the rulers of England and France take during the High Middle Ages? The High Middle Ages is this period from 1000 to 300, so to 1300, to reverse the decentralizing tendencies of fief holding. What were the major political and religious developments in Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the Northern Eastern Europe during the High Middle Ages? Well, and then it gives you the answer, the extension of royal authority. Well, growth of cities and revival of commerce, stuff that we talked about, the emergence of money economy. This is a bit exaggerated. Money never really left European economy. But it's often popular to talk about the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, which were where money disappeared from the economy, and there were places where the money almost completely disappeared. But anyhow, um, what they're talking about here is a process that stretches from the fall of the Roman Empire. And we took that date, traditional date of 476, the fall of the Roman Empire to the Germanic invaders, and then followed by Slavic and Muslim invasions. And that was, I don't know, in 711, Muslims crossed over into Spain and tried to take a foothold in Europe. Uh, all the way to the 1400s and 1500s, the period that we call the Renaissance. This is the time period that they call the Middle Ages. The biggest problem of the Middle Ages was the lack of central authority. The states that we knew before, like the Roman Empire, ceased to exist. Therefore, authority was localized, Europe was divided, pretty much every county on its own. And there was an attempt throughout this period to centralize this authority through a system that is called feudalism. Feudalism, we talked about it before, and I have on my PowerPoint here, it says, rise and the fall of the Middle Ages on slide number 2. And you have this feudal pyramid of power. This feudal pyramid of power, it applies to any kingdom, any monarchy in Europe in the Middle Ages. Ideally, not in reality. In other words, this is a simplification, a kind of a teaching tool, how to understand how these societies operated. And the societies that were divided according to the rank. And these ranks were, when on the top was a monarch, who in theory had all the power. In reality, no. Like any executive officer, in theory it has a lot of power. In reality, it has to build all sorts of coalitions to survive. Monarch is subordinate to the monarch is the nobility. To simplify all this, there are several ranks of nobility, but they're mostly, there is this rank of counts. And sometimes there are sub ranks over there, but the count is sort of your typical nobleman, count in charge of a county. And every county is divided into villages and castles and that sort of thing, and where we have knights. And these knights have people who are working for them, and you have people who are like merchants and craftsmen and independent farmers who are actually outside of this feudal system. They really don't owe any loyalty to those who are above them. They're sort of on the side. That's one of the reasons that city people are often in the Middle Ages following the slogan that the city air makes you free. So once you're out in the city, you're out of this feudal pyramid. This feudal pyramid comes and goes. It comes in various shapes and forms. The relationship between the monarch and the nobility, higher nobility, lower nobility, the peasants, varies a lot. But overall, you have these following phases. After the end of the Roman Empire, in the 5th, 6th, and 7th century, you have a complete decentralization of authority. So there is nothing really going on. And you have these Germanic chieftains, famously, I don't know, Clovis, the first king of France, who exercised the rule as a leader of war bands, as leaders of war bands. And then came around the Carolingian monarchy, Charles the Great, in the late 700s and early 800s. And Charles the Great was, in some ways, also a leader of a Germanic war band. He was a person who, with his counts and knights and other soldiers, was going around Europe and conquering societies, forcing them to swear loyalty to him and so on and so forth. So it was a typical Germanic warband. But Charles the Great also tried to create this feudal system, tried to put some order into this chaos that existed. So after his death, and especially after the death of his son, Louis the Pious, who was quite a weak ruler and kind of let the whole thing disintegrate one more time, the Carolingian monarchy disintegrated. And famously, I have it here and on slide number 3, it's split into 3 pieces. Now, this is really important for you to remember because it's going to be on the exam, definitely. The 3 sons of Louis the Pious, basically the 3 grandsons of Charlemagne, were Lothar the First, who actually inherited the title of the emperor. And he took a piece of the empire for him, and that piece was a stretch of land between Netherlands all the way down to Italy. So Netherlands through Switzerland and Italy. And then you have Charles the Bold of France and the Louis the German of Germany. So you have this division of the Carolingian monarchy into 3 great European states: France, Netherlands, and Germany. And therefore, each of these territories had a growth of its own kingdoms. Those are long and complicated stories of various fights and, between aristocracy and inheritance, and then children killing fathers and fathers killing children, and you name it, there is everything of this sort going on. But from roughly the year 1000 onwards, these 3 units, France, Netherlands, Italy, Germany, start to appear as kingdom, and you can see the foreshadowing of the modern states that exist there right now. The most interesting case in many ways is the conquest of England, and that's our slide number 4 here. My slide, that is, Rise and Fall of the Middle Ages, not Spielvogel. So the conquest of England, you have the picture here of the Tower of London, which was built by a person who was called William the Conqueror. William the Conqueror was actually not even English. He was French Scandinavian, so to speak. So during the 900s, in the 10th century, Scandinavians actually settled in the north of France, the area that's called Normandy, famous for the Normandy invasion in 1944 during World War II. So these Vikings settled in Normandy, and they became French. They adopted the French language, and through various events and circumstances, they ended up invading England. England was populated by Britons, who are the oldest layer of population, and then there were Angles and Saxons, who came from actually Germany and Holland, crossed over and conquered England. And there were also some Vikings, and so anyways, let's not get into details. There's a whole bunch of details here that is involved, that I'm trying to avoid. But the interesting part of the English story is that in 1066, this duke or count, duke is just a count with a very important county, in charge of a very important county. So Duke of Normandy, William, crossed over into England and conquered the kingdom. And he sort of had an opportunity to create an ideal feudal monarchy, because conquest gives you certain right. Basically, the whole country now belongs to you. And that's the ideal situation for every medieval monarch. In theory, all the land in medieval monarchy belonged to the monarch. But in theory, in the case of William the Conqueror, he actually conquered everything. So he could just remove the old landowners, bring the new ones, give these fiefdoms, right? Fiefdom is a piece of land that is given by a king to a count, for example. In England, those counts were called lords. So, and that lord then, can do with that land whatever he wants, as long as he serves the king, provides him with a certain amount of soldiers, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, we're talking about a very, very violent society that is trying to become pacified, trying to become more organized and better functioning than before. And you have this Tower of London as an example that, this was a countryside that was filled with castles of this kind. Not as big, but this is a king's castle, so not as big as this one. But they were filled of the smaller castles, all over the country, where it was ruled by this feudal elite. And very soon in England, this ideal situation developed to such a point that aristocracy, the lords of the kingdom, the counts that I was calling them before, wanted to participate in the government. They didn't want just to be told what the William the Conqueror and the dynasty that followed told them to do. So they used the first available opportunity to assert their rights. And the rights of the nobility were then expressed through assemblies of the nobility that were called parleys, where they talked. And therefore our word parliament comes from it. Originally, parliament was a court of law, namely when you had a dispute among the nobles, that or between a king and a nobleman, and something, and any sort of dispute on that level. You would have people brought in front of the council of the assembly of the nobility. They would, presided by the king. They would listen to these arguments and decide, on the case. So these are the origins of the parliament, and the most famous case is the case of King John the Lackland, who ruled from 1199 to 1216, and who actually faced a direct rebellion of his nobility, and was forced to issue Magna Carta. The document is called the Magna Carta, which defined the rights of the nobility, the trial by their peers, and other interesting things that organized the English state in a way that was better. Anyhow, let me see. What else do we have? Royal power. Right. William of Normandy, Henry, King John, Magna Carta. Right. I'm looking now to slide number 5. In Spielvogel, and that would be in my PowerPoint, would also be number 5. And there we have to talk about the French monarchy. As remember, there was this fellow Charles the Bold who got the third of the Carolingian kingdom, the western part that we called France. His successor didn't do too well, and France actually had to rebuild the monarchical power from practically nothing. So the development of France is sort of very different from the development in England. Development of England happened with this invasion from top down. It suddenly became a very organized state, which then gradually developed institutions, and the parliament started to meet in the 1200s after the Magna Carta and so on and so forth. However, the French monarchy was put together piece by piece by this very, very successful family, which ruled France from the founder of the family, Hugh Capet, 1987, who ruled 1987 to 1996. It would be a mistake to say that Hugh Capet ruled actually the whole of France. He ruled traditionally what was called the Ile-de-France, and that's the area around Paris. I told you last time around, and I'm repeating these slides now on slides number 6, number 7, and number 8, where you have the Ile de la Cité in the River Seine in Paris, and the nearby Royal Palace and the Notre Dame Cathedral. That was Paris. But the whole area around Paris, it was a very, actually one of the smaller counties in France. It was called Ile-de-France, or Isle of France. And out of there, the Capetian family gained control of whole of France. They ruled France from 1987, the same family, all the way till the revolution in France that happened in 1789 and 1792, actually, when the King of France was executed by the revolutionaries. So they ruled for a good 800 years. Very often, anyways, it's interesting to mention that when the French Revolution happened, the king was divested of his power, and he was simply known as the king, King Louis the 16th. And so the revolutionaries were not sure how to give him a last name, and then somebody remembered that they come from a Capet family. So, when he ceased being king, he then was known as Citizen Capet. And that's the founder of the dynasty some 800 years before the events of the French Revolution. Capetians, so the family, during these 800 years, the family branched. In other words, it was not the eldest son who inherited the throne, who became next king, but one of the younger sons. And so then we kind of give separate names to these dynasties in France, like the Valois and the Bourbon. But that's a minor story. For our purposes, they are all Capetians. Capet, after Hugh Capet, the Count of Ile-de-France, and the creator of the French state, in some ways. The French also had a state even before the Carolingians, and there was this German chieftain called Clovis, who came into France and around the year 500. And actually was baptized. And the place where he was baptized is the city called Reims in the north of France. And I included the picture of the Reims Cathedral here on slide number 9, and then on slide number 10, which says Ici Saint-Rémy baptisa Clovis, roi de France, which means that here on this spot in the cathedral, Saint Remigius, Saint Remy, a bishop, local bishop of that place, baptized Clovis, the king of the Franks. So he traditionally considered as the first Christian ruler of the French state. And Cathedral of Reims, other than, is this one of the most beautiful Gothic cathedrals that exist around in France. And France, there is a good competition for the cathedrals, but Cathedral at Reims is the most important cathedral in the kingdom. Probably, not just probably, it was way more important than the Notre Dame in Paris, which became famous through a book and the musical later on and so on and so forth. But Reims was a much more serious business than just the henchback of Notre Dame. So Reims is the place where traditionally the French kings were baptized, not baptized, they were crowned, sorry. That's the place where Clovis, the first king, was baptized. But then, in honor of that event, all the kings of France would then be crowned. And one of the traditions was also that the kings during the coronation ceremony were also anointed with oil. That is, some oil is put of them, and there is a whole Catholic tradition over how the vessel in which the sacred oil is kept kind of fills itself before the night of the coronation with oil for the coronation of the French king. Anyways, those are kind of interesting stories that might help you remember this wonderful cathedral. So we so far covered 2 great European states: England, which existed before 1066, but after 1066 it becomes a unified kingdom and continues this existence all the way to modern day. And now France, which kind of starts on a very, very different path. Capet family, Capetian dynasty, gradually expanded their power through France and through marriages and alliances and then through conquests, and then build this great European state and kingdom. The next thing is, we have to deal with Germany. And Germany didn't have this luck that France and England had. Germany became, there was a medieval German kingdom, and we'll talk about several German kings and dynasties in this regard. But that kingdom failed. And it failed because it got into a conflict with the church. And that's one of the big themes of these 2 chapters, the conflict between kings and the church. So to know more about this, we need to go to Germany. We have slide number 11 here. This beautiful cathedral is the Strayer Cathedral on the Rhine, near the city of Frankfurt. It's a little bit south of Frankfurt. A famous cathedral. Germany started as the western part of the Carolingian Empire, but it was at first ruled by the so-called Ottonian dynasty, and then the Salian dynasty. So that's listed on the slide number 12, and you have something that will give you an idea of the complexity of this chapter. So I'm trying to run through it very quickly. But on the left side, you have slide number 12, you have Ottonian dynasty that ruled from 1919 to 1024. And you have the emperors Henry the First, Otto the First, Otto the Second, Otto the Third, Henry the Second. And then from 1024 to 1125, from the next 100 years, you have the so-called Salian dynasty and Conrad II, Henry the Third, Henry the Fourth, and Henry the Fifth. It's important to notice that German emperors, German kings of Germany, so to speak, also had pretensions. They wanted the title of the emperor. And that title of the emperor was linked with the Pope. In other words, that goes back all the way to the times of Charlemagne, when Charlemagne went for Christmas in Rome in the year 800. He wanted to be crowned emperor, and Pope sort of surprised him and crowned him emperor on the Christmas day. Well, from that time on, there was a tradition that developed, and there was a whole justification of that tradition, why the emperor could give this symbolic power to the kings of Germany. That practically meant that, kings of Germany were also considered the kings of Italy. And that really complicated things, but both for the Italians and for the Germans. Kings of the Ottonian dynasty were very powerful, and they didn't face much resistance from the papacy. Well, the papacy in itself was a weak institution. But around the year 1000, papacy was actually reformed. And it was reformed through a monastic order that came out of the Benedictine monks that, we were talking about before. But this monastic order has its origin in the French monastery called Cluny. Is this listed somewhere? Maybe. Cluny. Anyways, these monks reorganized the papacy, and among the other things that they invented a new way how to elect popes. That was one of the bigger problems of medieval Europe. Who is going to elect pope? And emperors and strong kings often assumed that it was their duty. They would appoint popes. Popes were bishops of Rome. That's fairly simple. So they would appoint popes as would appoint any other officer in their kingdom. I was planning to have the picture, but I don't. There's a picture of a ceremony that is called investiture. That's a ceremony by which a king confers an office onto a certain person. And that's how the kings treated the papal office. He's a bishop of Rome. The emperor is in charge of Rome, so he should be appointed by the emperor. Well, that's not what the Cluniac monks wanted. And they devised this system of cardinals. Cardinals are bishops, and it's a system that still exists today, now 1,000 years later. Cardinals are bishops of the church, Catholic Church. They could be bishops anywhere, but in this case we're talking about bishops of the various bishops of Europe. But Bishop of New York is a cardinal, Bishop of Newark is a cardinal, and so on and so forth. So these are bishops who in addition have this additional title, cardinal, which means they are the electors of the Pope. So when one Pope dies, this cardinal gather in Rome, and there is about, over 200 of them, and they decide and vote who the next pope going to be. This system actually gives the Roman Church a huge amount of independence from the kings that you're looking here at slide number 12 of the Salian dynasty: Conrad II, Henry III, Henry IV, and Henry V. And in particular, it was Henry IV who tried and tested this idea. So the popes then, once they're elected, they then appointed bishops all over the kingdoms in Europe. And those bishops were then chosen people by the pope, so they would be normally obedient to the pope because he chose them. But there, the kings of Europe pushed back, and he said, well, maybe these bishops are in the church, but they're also in my kingdom, and they have enormous power and influence, symbolic, but important nonetheless. So Henry IV actually directly, the emperor of the Salian dynasty, directly challenged the Pope Gregory VII over his right to appoint bishops in his kingdom. He was then, the kingdom, Germany, was put under the interdict, that is, the church services in Germany were stopped. No baptism, no burials, no communions, no mass, anointing of the sick, nothing of that sort. And the Germans then, especially the nobility, rose up against the emperor, said, you got to fix this, and he had to go to the Pope Gregory VII to apologize. So anyways, that's the beginning of the German kingdom, Ottonian and the Salian dynasty. After the Ottonian and the Salian dynasty came dynastic rivalry, which marked the whole of the Middle Ages, not just in Germany, but in particular in Italy. There was a Hohenstaufen dynasty, which you have here on slide number 13. And there was a rival dynasty, the Welf dynasty, which ruled relatively briefly. So anyways, the most important representative of this Hohenstaufen dynasty is Frederick Barbarossa, who ruled from 1855 and to 1155 to 1190. He's probably the best example of these German troubles that I was talking about before. German troubles were actually their obsession with Italy. And Frederick Barbarossa went down to Lombardy, the northern parts of Italy, one that is now very heavily hit by the epidemics. And he tried to conquer this city and make them into the Roman Empire with an idea that Germany should be the strongest state in Europe and should include control over the church, and that included the control of Italy. It went really bad because the popes resisted. So factions developed in Italy, in every city of Italy actually, those who were supporters of the emperor of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, and those who were supporters of the Pope. So those people are called the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, in case you were to run into those, because it will come back. It might come back to haunt us later on when we talk about the Renaissance. But there was an imperial faction and there was a papal faction. And the imperial faction wanted Italian cities to be part of this German empire, and the popes didn't want that. In the end, the popes won during the reign of another important emperor of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, Frederick II, who ruled from 1220 to 1250. There on the left you have his tomb in the Palermo Cathedral, so he managed actually to get hold of the southern part of Italy, which was the first for the Germans. And there you have a golden coin by his with his likeness. So he's portrayed there as the Roman Empire. This garland that he wears is the traditional crown of the Roman emperors. So Frederick II was a very interesting person. He was one of the most educated medieval monarchs, but he clashed with the papacy, and it didn't end well neither for him nor for the dynasty. By the middle of the 13th century, the German kingdom disintegrated and became this strange thing that is going to follow us through history. That's called, the Holy Roman Empire of the German people, which were people joking that it was neither holy nor it was Roman, nor it was much of an empire. It was a system of various regional rulers of Germany, sometimes bishops, sometimes dukes or counts, or aristocracy of that level, no kings. And these people would come together and they would elect among themselves an emperor who would technically be, the king of the Germans and the king of this Holy Roman Empire. The full title was the Holy Roman Empire of the German people. And this chaotic situation continued from the middle of the 13th century all the way until the unification of Germany well into the second half of the 19th century. So that much about Germany. Another great European kingdom that we need to mention is the Kingdom of Spain. Spain was one of the wealthiest provinces of the Roman Empire. It was conquered by the Visigoths, and who established their kingdom there in the same manner that Clovis established a kingdom in France. So Visigoths established a kingdom in Spain, and their capital was the city of Toledo, which is the ancient capital of Spain. One of the most beautiful cities in Spain. You have a picture of that city on the slide number 15. It says Spain, Toledo, its ancient capital. That's the old Visigoth capital. What happened to Spain? It was the 711. It was conquered by the Muslims. The people crossed over from Africa with a new religion that we talked about before, and went into Spain, and they conquered practically the whole of Spain, with the exception of the mountains of northern Spain. And this fellow, who claimed to have been a descendant of the Visigoths, Don Pelayo of Asturias. Here on the slide number 16, you have Don Pelayo of Asturias. And Don Pelayo resisted the Muslims, the Muslim invasion, or what they're called the Moors in Spain. And he started the process which was called the Reconquista. He holds there in his hand the so-called, one of the greatest relics of the Kingdom of Spain, that is called the Cross of Asturias. So Asturias was not the only state that, it was the only state that started the fight, but then other regions of Spain started rebelling against the Muslim rule. And out of this rebellion came the kingdoms of Castilla and Aragon as the most important. Castilla is the central part of Spain, the Spanish highlands, the places like Madrid, Segovia, Valladolid, and so on. Those are ancient cities in Castilla. And then Aragon is the capital of Zaragoza in the east of the country, and the most important part of Aragon was the county of Barcelona, which is in the eastern part of Spain. These kingdoms of Castilla and Aragon fought the Moors for centuries and eventually kicked them out in 1492 out of the Imperial Peninsula when the last Muslim stronghold, the city of Granada in the south of Spain, was liberated by the Spanish kings. But more importantly, actually, before the conquest of Granada happened and the liberation of Granada and the final liberation of Spain from the Muslim invasion, was that that the king of Aragon and the queen of Spain married. Fernando of Aragon and Isabel of Castilla married in the later part of the 15th century, and thus you have something what is called the personal union. So their son was then king of both Castilla and Aragon, and this is what we call today Spain. So this is the most important part of our chapter, namely the history of various kingdoms in Europe. The book talks about other parts here, Scandinavia, Russia, but that's way too much for us. These, how many? England, France, Germany, Italy, and Spain would do. Good enough. I'm looking at this slide number 8 in Spielvogel, chapter 10, which gives you a lot of important events here. Oh gosh, he really goes into details. Anyways, most of these terms over here, even some I didn't talk about. Philip Augustus of France, or it would be just too much, overburdened with details. This book is full of details, and you rarely get the full picture. But anyways, you have a couple of important English kings, William the Conqueror, John the Lackland, and so on and so forth, the first parliament, and things of that sort. Spain, a couple of rulers in Spain there, anyways. The one that is important, Pelayo, that I mentioned, is not mentioned, so be it as it may. Germany, Frederick Barbarossa. Okay, you'll be able to survive this one. You'll be able to have an idea what's going on. Let me see. We covered then a lot of huge chunk of this chapter. Slide number 16 in Spielvogel 10 has a focus question. What were the characteristics of the papal monarchy and the new religious order of the High Middle Ages, and what role did women play in the religious life of the period? What was the Church's attitude toward heretics and Jews during the High Middle Ages? A lot of stuff in there, but growth of the papal monarchy is the things that I explained to you with the College of Cardinals and this way of electing the Pope. So this is what is called the papal curia. Curia is a papal administration, which was then run by the cardinals. And this great Pope Innocent III, who was one of the strongest medieval popes, investiture controversy on slide number 7. We talked about it. Who is going to appoint bishops? Is it the king who is going to do it, or the Pope? So it's another element of this conflict between the monarchies of Europe and the papacy. And this conflict goes up and down. There is actually no clear winner. But in the great consequence of this conflict is that church in Europe, in particular in Western Europe, became independent of the monarchy. It had its own organization, and it was run as a state within the state, a separate structure. It was, not always, there were a lot of issues, as everything in history. The devil is in the details. Here on the slide number 17, you have this Cluniac reform movement, and who reformed papacy and stuff, and the issue of investiture and investiture controversy. Basically, investiture is when a certain person in the kingdom gets invested into a certain office, when he receives that office. And it's usually an investiture by a king. So anyways, let's see. We have also new monastic orders that appeared. One of the interesting things that happened in this period is the old monks, like the Cluniac monks of Cluny, and the Benedictine monks. These were the monasteries that started this monastic order, and they developed, so to speak, sister houses. That's how they called. There was a mother house, and then there were daughter houses. So there would be a monastery, and you would have hundreds of monks gathered there, and then 10 of them would leave and go somewhere else, and start another monastery, and that monastery would grow, and and a group of those monks would move to another place and build another monasteries. So, but these monks, the Benedictine monks that we mentioned, and the Cluniac monks, were monks who were monks of the countryside. With what we were talking about last time around, with the growth of the European cities, and the growth of universities, that is, the need for learning, and that learning was needed basically to write down contracts of various, for various businesses that were happening in Europe. So a new kind of clergy was needed. And that new kind of clergy were called friars, which brothers, this is what mean brothers, and two sort of urban orders developed. They're often called mendicant orders because mendicare in Latin means to beg. So these are monks who are not actually living off the land in the same way that the Benedictines and the Cluniac monks were living. They had their own monastery, they had their land, they took care of it, they fed themselves, they were independent. But the city monks were not independent. They depended on begging, on the alms given by the people of the city. And usually people were very jealous, so these monks became well off and fat, so to speak. Two of them, Franciscans and Dominicans, two different orders, one founded by St. Francis of Assisi, who was an Italian of the city of Assisi, and famously had a dream that, he didn't have a dream. It's actually the Pope had a dream. Anyways, he went to the Pope to get approval for his monastic order. He had this idea about begging monks, mendicant monks, monk beggars. And he went to the Pope to get an approval, and the Pope actually that night had a dream that the church was falling apart, and one of the columns that supports the church was kind of fell on a shoulder of a young man that he had never seen before. And then in the morning, it was Saint Francis who came to the Pope and asked the Pope for the approval for his monastic order, and he said, "Yes, I remember you. I saw you in a dream." So, anyways, that's the story about the Franciscans. Saint Francis, famous for preaching to the birds and dogs and cats and wild animals and so on and so forth. He was also briefly captured by the Muslims, and he tried to preach to them too, but that didn't go too well. But, that's a minor point. Well, maybe we will do St. Francis as an ID later on Thursday. And then there is St. Dominic. St. Dominic was the founder of the Dominican monks. And Dominican monks were most famous for their learning. They were educators in the cities, not just beggars. They also, educated people. The most famous of all Dominican friars and Dominican brothers was Saint Thomas Aquinas. Saint Thomas Aquinas, who wrote the probably the most influential textbook of theology of the Middle Ages. Anyways, Franciscans and Dominicans, St. Francis and St. Dominic. And then we have various heretics and so on and so forth. Let's skip that. Let's not bombard you with unnecessary information. So there on the slide number 20, you have a bit of chronology of the church and the transformation it was going through. Foundation of the Abbey of Cluny in 1910. It was in France, and the church was actually destroyed during the French Revolution. Then you have Pope Gregory VII, who came into conflict with Henry IV, the German emperor, over this is called the investiture controversy. There was a decree against lay investiture in 1075, the beginning of this conflict between Gregory VII and Henry, which actually allowed the popes to appoint their own bishops. Pope Urban II, we didn't talk about him, forget it. Founding of the Cistercian monks, 1099, well, also fairly important. Cistercian monks were particularly associated with the Crusades and Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. But anyways, we'll talk about Cistercians maybe a little bit more than, but there was another order of monks. In other words, there was a great diversity within the medieval Catholic Church. That there were all kinds of ways of being a monk in the church, and you could have. There were the black friars, there were white friars, there were Capuchin monks, or these Franciscan. There's a special kind of the Franciscan monk. Or these the Capuchin monks because they had a habit that was of that sort of coffee color, and other orders that didn't mention here. Pope Innocent III, probably the strongest of the medieval popes, and then all the other popes who came afterwards basically not that they were just not so strong, but they fairly quickly actually had to be very careful how to deal with these European monarchs, because the power of the European monarchs was growing. The European states were being better and better organized, and what the Pope can do in the 11th and the 12th century, it couldn't dream in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century, where the kings of Europe became much more powerful than the church. But the church, out of this chaos, came out relatively independent from the state, and our separation of church and state to some extent originates in this period. Finally, we have the crusade against the Albigensians. That's one of the, there was a bunch of heretics in the south of France that were eliminated. But anyways, and the Fourth Lateran Council, which was one of the councils of the church where the Pope would occasionally gather to decide over important issues of faith. Slide 21 is the picture of Pope Innocent III, medieval nuns, and so on and so forth. And then slide 24, the Crusades. Let's leave the Crusades for next time. I think this is going to be enough for us now. We covered a lot. Well, much less than I thought. Well, maybe not. Maybe not. Not bad. So far, so good. Let's stop here. And I add something on Thursday about the Crusades, and we go from here. All right.